Chapter 13, Part 3 of History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries by Samuel Cheetham. Chapter 13, Part 3, Ecclesiastical Ceremonies and Art. Socrates, the historian, noticing the diversity of practice in different regions with regard to the observance of the Paschal festival, points out that the observance of special days and months and years had no scriptural authority. The Mosaic law had, he says, no direct bearing upon the Christian Church, and the ceremonies and observances which he saw in actual use had arisen, for the most part, simply from local use and want. The cycle of festivals satisfied a craving of human nature. As for the apostles, they did not aim at giving rules for feast days, but at promoting piety and righteousness. This is true. The end of the observance of special days and hours is the maintaining and raising of the spiritual life of the Church. But in time, festivals and fasts of universal observance acquire a sacredness which few dispute. The Lord's Day and the stations of Wednesday and Friday were already observed before the end of the 3rd century. Constantine is said to have closed the law courts and forbidden labor on the Friday as well as on the Sunday, the Wednesday being probably always a day less strictly observed. Socrates notes, as a primeval custom of the Alexandrians, that on the Wednesday and Friday the scriptures are read and expositions given in the churches, that, in short, everything belonging to the solemn assembly is done, except the actual celebration. Everywhere, in the early part of the 5th century, there was a celebration of the Holy Eucharist on the Sabbath, that is, Saturday, excepting at Alexandria and Rome, where a local custom forbade it, while in the parts of Egypt bordering on Alexandria and in Thebaid, the inhabitants had a custom on that day differing from that of the rest of Christendom. They partook of the Eucharist in the evening after a sumptuous repast. In the West, however, and particularly at Rome, Saturday became a fast day, and had no celebration of the Eucharist. 4 times in the year, once in each of the 4 seasons of the year, 3 days of the week, our Ember Days, were observed with special solemnity. This custom appears to be peculiar to the Roman Patriarchate, and not to be older than the 5th century. The disputes as to the proper time of celebrating Easter still continued in the period with which we are now concerned. At the Council of Nicaea, it was agreed that all the churches should conform to the use which was observed in Egypt, Africa, Italy, and the West generally. It is not clear that the Council laid down any rule for the determination of Easter Day. Certainly it did not put an end to the controversy. The Quartodeciman practice still required to be repressed at the time of the Council of Constantinople in the year 381, and indeed did not die out until the 6th century. Even Rome and Alexandria often celebrated their Easter on a different day. This difference arose partly from the fact that the 2 churches used different cycles for the computation of the day of the Paschal full moon, partly from the Romans holding that Easter Day must never fall earlier than the 16th day of the Paschal moon, while the Alexandrians allowed it to be celebrated on the 15th, and the Roman tradition did not allow Easter Day to fall later than April 21st, while Alexandrian custom extended the Paschal limit to the 25th. The Britons observed Easter Sunday so early as the 14th day of the Paschal moon, if it so fell according to their antiquated cycle, a practice which became a point of difference between them and the Roman missionaries under Augustine. An important step towards uniformity was made when Victorius of Aquitaine, about A.D. 457, composed a new cycle combining the Alexandrian lunar cycle of 19 years with the solar cycle of 28 years, thus forming the Victorian period of 532 years. Still, discrepancies occurred, until the matter was finally set at rest by the Roman abbot Dionysius Exiguus, the same who introduced the era Anno Domini into chronology. He employed the Victorian period in the Easter table, which he constructed, and in fact seems to have done little more than adapt the Victorian calculations to his own era of the Nativity. The table of Dionysius was received almost universally in the East and West, and from this time we have little controversy about the date of Easter Day, except where, as in Britain, the Roman missionaries found a church standing on older ways than their own. The 40 days preceding Easter are mentioned as days of special observance from the 4th century, and are regarded as the time for preparing candidates for baptism, penitents for absolution, and the faithful generally for joining worthily into the Paschal festival. One of the observances of such a season was naturally fasting, but the nature and extent of this varied considerably in different places. The extension of the Lenten fast in the Alexandrian Patriarchate may be traced in the festal letters of Athanasius from the year 329 to 347. At the earliest date, he speaks of the season of the 40 days and the week of fasting. At the latest, of the 40 days fast and the Holy Week before Easter. At Rome, only 3 weeks before Easter were at this time observed by fasting, and even in these the Sabbath and the Lord's Day were not fasts. In the Church of Antioch and its dependencies, the 40 days seem to have been distinguished from Holy Week, while at Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome, Holy Week was included in them. Towards the middle of the 5th century, the churches generally agreed in observing specially the 6 weeks preceding Easter. Deducting Sundays, this period included only 36 days of actual fasting, a circumstance which led to the addition to the Lent fast of the 4 days preceding the first Sunday in Lent. This addition was, however, not made in Rome at least until the time of Gregory the Great. The week which immediately precedes Easter Day, the emphatically Holy Week, was specially observed from a very early period. The term Palm Sunday does not seem to be applied to the Lord's Day which begins this week by any earlier authority than Isidore of Seville in the early part of the 7th century. On the Thursday of this week, our Maundy Thursday, the institution of the Holy Eucharist was specially commemorated, and in some churches the faithful communicated on this day after taking their evening meal, a reminiscence of the circumstances of the original institution. Good Friday, the day on which the Lord's crucifixion was commemorated, was a day for the strictest fasting and for every display of sadness and mourning. On this day there was no Eucharist. At Jerusalem the true cross was exposed to the faithful, who on this day alone were permitted to approach and kiss it. On Easter Eve the joy of the approaching festival began to appear. Troops of neophytes were buried with Christ in baptism. The numbers of the faithful passed the night in the churches waiting for his resurrection. Abundant lamps were lighted, and in some places fires were kindled. The introduction of the blessing of the Paschal taper is attributed to Pope Zosimus early in the 5th century. The day of the resurrection itself was celebrated with every sign of joy and exaltation, which was prolonged in some degree to the feast of Pentecost. From the middle of the 4th century, the 40th day after Easter, Holy Thursday, was observed as a commemoration of the Lord's Ascension. In the East, the manifestation of the Lord, both at his birth and at his baptism, was celebrated on the 6th of January in the 4th century, while at the same period in Rome and its dependencies, the 25th of December was observed as the day of Christ's Nativity. But the festival of January 6th seems to have been then unknown there. In the 5th century, the observance of the 25th of December as the Nativity had spread into the East, and that of the 6th of January as the Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles and also his baptism, had extended into the West, so that both festivals were observed by almost the whole Church. The first mention of the Epiphany in the West appears to be in the year 360, when Julian, not yet a declared pagan, attended the church services on that day at Vienne in Gaul. 40 days after the commemoration of the Lord's Nativity,